And so now with that Bodhichitta motivation in mind, we could do the verse of Refuge and Bodhichitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Well, I guess it's just nice to see everybody. And I guess we'll return to the text, and then we'll sort of, I guess I'll just maybe briefly just mention, oh good, text is I really appreciate, I was thinking about last class, I really appreciate people like asking questions, engaging with the material, and and asking genuine questions. That was good. So I hope we'll keep doing that all together. And in the text itself, so we're on in general, right, we're on I said this early on, right, Tibetan text is always like outlines, right? So in the general sense, we're in the section on the Great Exposition, or the Vaibhashika school. And then each school has like 7 headings that are the same for each of the 4 schools that are covered. And so on the Great Exposition or Vaibhashika school, we're in section 4 of the 7, which is the way of asserting objects. And last class, we went into what's the definition of an object or an existent thing. And we went over one of the categories, one of the ways this school, well, all Buddhist schools, but this school in particular, asserts object, which is they can categorize them into permanent things and impermanent things. So we covered that last time. So today we're going to start with the next way of categorizing phenomena, which is conventional truths and ultimate truths. And part of the point there, right, is that one is that categorization of conventional and ultimate exists in all these 4 Buddhist schools, right? But they're going to define what they are differently. You see what I mean? So the word conventional truth and ultimate truth exists, right, in each of the 4 schools, but they define what those mean differently. So here we're doing conventional truths and ultimate truths according to the Vaibhashika school. And so, and that, in this translation, that's on page 4, right? So it says, another way of dividing things is into conventional truths is 1, and ultimate truths, number 2. And pretty good to read. I'll read what what Jetsun Chogi Gelson says here, and then we'll talk about it. We'll start with the conventional truth, right? So a definition of conventional truth is a phenomena such that an awareness apprehending it is canceled if it is broken up or mentally separated into its individual parts. Illustrations of conventional truths are, for example, a vase and a woolen cloth, because if a vase is broken with a hammer, the mind apprehending it is canceled. If a woolen cloth is separated into its individual threads, the mind apprehending it is canceled. I'll just pause there, right? So there he's saying, so one point is, so conventional truth objects, right, or phenomena, and obviously they exist, right? They're existent phenomena like a vase, right? But so I'm just wondering, so notice the definition of it, right? A vase exists, but it's made up of parts, right? And if you separate, as long as the vase is whole and you're not, either it's not being physically broken or you're not mentally breaking it down into its parts, then you apprehend it, right? So it's an existent object. But it's a conventional truth because, in this school, right, it's a conventional truth because if you were to break it down into its parts, then the consciousness apprehending it would be canceled, wouldn't exist anymore, right? And so maybe I'll just keep going and kind of read his, because I don't think that's going to make sense until you hear his definition of ultimate truth, and then we'll talk about it and sort of discuss the implications of these definitions and terms and ideas. But then he says, the definition of ultimate truth is a phenomena such that an awareness apprehending it is not canceled if it is broken up or mentally separated into its individual parts. Illustrations of ultimate truths are, for example, directionally partless particles, temporally partless moments of consciousness, and uncompounded phenomena. And then he quotes the Treasury of Manifest Knowledge, the Abhidharma Kosha, which says, those things such as pot or water that the mind cannot engage if they are broken or mentally separated into other things exist as conventional truths. Others exist as ultimate truths. I'll just pause there. Right, so here he then gives the definition of ultimate truths, right? And so let's use the first one, right? Directionally partless particles. Right? So according to this goal, those would be like the smallest existent. Last time I mentioned this, right? These would be actually I mentioned this last time. Just it was really interesting, isn't it? That like this term directionally partless particles are often translated as atoms, right? And this school, developed had an atomic theory of atoms, right? Atomic theory. Right, which actually, it's funny that I was saying that last time. It's a little funny that we use the word atoms for that, because atoms actually, were developed by, I think his name was Democritus. The word atoms was first used in Greece 400 years later, actually, than the Buddha. So actually it existed, this atomic theory, this theory of tiny particles existed long before it was developed in Greece, in India. And this school kind of ascribes to that theory, that view. And so they would say those things, right, directionally partless particles cannot be subdivided. So the consciousness apprehending those cannot be canceled by their being broken into parts, because they can't be broken. They're the smallest things that exist, and they can exist. And then they also say the same thing of temporarily partless moments of consciousness, right? That those are not subdividable. So if you were to say like my awareness yesterday, right, that would be a conventional truth, right? Because, yesterday was 24 hours, right? So yesterday exists as a conventional truth, right? But if you say, well, but if you subdivide like yesterday into 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. and 8 p.m., right? Then then you focus on one part of those, and you're conscious and you're aware, and the conscious apprehending all of the consciousness of yesterday is canceled. So that would only be a conventional truth, right? But if you come down to a singular moment of consciousness, that's not subdividable according to this school, and therefore that would be an ultimate truth object. I'm trying to say whether to pause there. It might be good to just pause there. Like I want to share more. I mean, that's basically what Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen says, but there's a lot to bring out about that, which I'll bring up in a minute. But actually, well, maybe I will say one other thing, right? Conventional truth objects. He says wool and cloth, right? And so that's pretty clear, isn't it? Like in other words, when you if you look at a woolen cloth, it's like a blanket or something, right? But he's saying if you were to pull out all the strands, obviously you would no longer perceive a blanket, right? You would perceive a heap of wool. So the woolen blanket exists, right? But it's conventional truth. It's not it doesn't exist ultimately, right? Whereas the particles, the atomic particles of it do exist ultimately. Other typical examples that, you could say a forest is an example of that, right? In other words, when you see a forest, it exists, right? It's made up, but if you just stare at one tree, that's not, if you subdivide it and you look at a part of a tree, at a branch, you no longer apprehend the forest, right? So the forest is not an ultimate truth. It's a conventional truth, right? Or a mala, right? It's a typical example that Tibetans would use, monks, right? Mala exists, right? But again, like if I cut that string and gave various people an individual bead, right? The consciousness apprehending the mala would no longer exist. Then you would have an apprehension of a bead. Then if somebody smashed the bead into pieces, you would no longer see a bead, you would see little fragments, right? And so from their perspective, this school's perspective, eventually if you came down to the finest, minutest atomic particles, then that would be an ultimate truth. Yeah, I'll pause there and see if people have questions and then I'll go on.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Those first two items on the list to me seem to be right on the order of, the horns of a rabbit, things that you can conjure up in your head, but they don't really have any existence. I was trying to figure out the way to say that.
Do you mean the vase and the woolen cloth?
No, I'm sorry. In the ultimate truth section.
Oh, the directionally partless particles and the temporarily partless moments.
Yes. Clearly, we can't sense those things. So there's no difference from trying to think of something that's to us impossible or inconceivable. So we conceive of something inconceivable. So I guess that gets back to the question last week of is the thought permanent, which I guess one of the tenet systems does consider thoughts and images to be permanent. But I'm just picking nits here on those two.
I think it's a good question. And actually, I think it implies something. So, Paul, I'll say a few things in relation to your question. Maybe I don't have a correct answer.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's useful. It's an important point you're making. And I think, let's say this right. According to this school, right? This is actually a huge point, right? This school says these ultimate truths, right? So an ultimate truth, like a directionally partless particle or a temporally partless moment of consciousness. First of all, if you were to ask, so if we go to a proponent of this school and say, following up on the first part of Paul's comment, right? If you were to go to a proponent of this school and say, well, can ordinary people perceive directionally partless particles or temporarily partless moments? That person would say, no, of course not. Those are ultimate truths. Who can perceive ultimate truths? Aryas, right? So from this school's perspective, an ordinary person like most of us or us cannot perceive those objects, right? We only perceive, just as it's interesting, isn't it? Like in the Prasangika Majjhimaka school, right? They say also only Aryas perceive the ultimate truth, right, of emptiness, right? So if that school's perspective would be, if you say, can you directly perceive emptiness? Well, of course, only an Arya perceives that. Right? Only somebody who's seen emptiness directly. In this school, only somebody who's seen selflessness directly can perceive these ultimate truth objects of, for example, the partless particles and I often just want to pause and reflect on this now, because I think this has a lot of implications that are interesting. One is I always pause when I bring up Arya. I often pause and bring this up. I always think that term is interesting, right? So in Buddhism, we use the term Arya to refer to, Arya. Like I always pause because it always has a resonance for me. In the sense that Arya is often translated as noble, right? That's often the way it's translated, and and people know this probably, right? But that the Buddha used that term in this radical way, right? Arya, at his time, people say that in India at his time that Arya meant high caste, being of high caste in the caste system, right? And he completely undermined that use, right? He said, no, that's not what Arya, that's not what's noble. That's not what's Arya. Arya, I guess for me, it has a resonance partly because, right, the Nazis actually used the word Arya, didn't they? The Aryan race they used, right? So it's a phrase, it's a phrase that came to, in ancient India, it was associated with caste. It's a phrase that came to be associated with white supremacy, actually, over time, clearly, right, in human history. And the Buddha insisted that was the wrong understanding, right, of Arya. Right? That nobility was not about your birth, it was not about your race, it was not about your caste, it was about whether you saw reality or not. which I always find touching to think about. How it was connected to your commitment and realization of the truth, not of your social position, not of your race, and so on. So in Buddhism, right, Arya means that. It's a very profound term, right? Which means it means somebody who's seen the truth directly. And so from this school's perspective, right, this school agrees with that interpretation from the Buddha, right? And so this school's perspective would be selflessness, right? Somebody who's seen selflessness directly is an Arya. And I want to share, so in terms of what Paul was raising about ultimate truths, right? So these ultimate truths are not seen then by ordinary people. Like ordinary people, we can only see the woolen cloth, right? We can pull apart the woolen cloth and see the strands, right? And we can then recognize, oh, wow, that consciousness apprehending a blanket is canceled. But if we try to perceive the minute atomic particles, we can't do that. And again, if we try to perceive, and this, what is a temporally partless moment of consciousness? There are different, I always think that there are like different schools of Buddhism, say different lengths, right? But they usually use a finger snap. In Buddhism, right, they often use a finger snap. And then some people say it's 1/20th, 1/120th. Some Mahayan schools say it's 1/365th of a finger snap. One text I read, though, said in this school it was 1/120th of a finger snap. We'll use that. So that's a very short period of time, obviously. And what are they getting at? Because I think that's what Paul's saying. Do these even exist, right? Of course,
No.
You said they don't exist.
Well, I'm saying you could say they exist, and I could say they couldn't, and that doesn't. Neither one of us can present proof either direction. So to me, I'm not sure. Useless, not useful, maybe is a better phrase.
Okay. And I want to give two different points in relation to that are kind of related to something we talked about last time a little bit. Like one is, say a philosopher who's Vaibhashika. I want to give two different reasons why they assert, like why I think their assertion of these, how they assert or why they assert them. Or, something, I don't know what the word is. But one is from their perspective, remember, they're trying to avoid nihilism, right? The nihilism that nothing exists. And so one point is, from their perspective, they would say, there have to be, for example, I'm going to use the example of the directionally partless particles. Their view would be, those must exist. Otherwise, objects couldn't form, right? Like we know that objects are formed from parts, that like if you see a physical object, it's made up of things that are then smaller things. And they recognized, right, that through their meditation and their contemplation, that that things, one is that if things are made up of parts, then there have to be smaller parts and smaller parts. Their view was, if you keep going smaller and smaller, as Dalai Lama often points out, right? Prasangika Madhyamaka philosophers and modern subatomic physicists agree, right, that if you keep going in that process, you eventually come to find that there's no substantial substrate.
It's turtles all the way down.
Yeah, and this school would say, this school's view was, if there's no substrate, then you would have nihilism, then nothing exists, then there's no matter at all, right? So one reason why this school asserts these directionally partless particles is as a way of avoiding nihilism, as a way of saying, well, there is a substrate, things do exist. That's one point. So they were trying to, this is their way of, in one part, this is their way of preventing or avoiding the fault of nihilism, which, as we said last time or the time before, I can't remember which, is the worst philosophical fault. But then I wanted to raise another reason why they, because their view also, though, is that Aryas perceive actually these. And I wanted to share something. I was sort of contemplating that. I wanted to share something. Like this is from Jan Willis's book, Enlightened Beings, Life Stories from the Ganden Oral Tradition. And I just want, it's a very brief passage, but there's a famous, and I'm sharing this because I think it gets at this point. There's a very famous Ganden, so Gelugpa yogi, great yogi named Gyawa and Sapa. Many times, Tibetan lamas will mention him because he's very famous. They sometimes like say he was like Milarepa. They sometimes say he's famous for having achieved enlightenment in one lifetime. He went into intensive retreat and achieved full enlightenment in one life. He was like a great scholar, but particularly a great yogi who spent many, many years in mountain retreats. And there's a passage that Jan Willis translates in his biography that says, it describes how he achieved samadhi, right? Meditative concentration. It says he gave up all the 8 worldly concerns and went to solitary places, thinking of nothing but yogic practice, and he performed the heart of the profound path. He was able to remain in meditative concentration, samadhi, day and night. And it says, on account of this, he was able to subdue whatever manifestations of the afflictive emotions, such as desire, might arise. And he was able to settle his mind upon any meritorious meditative object of any nature that he wished. And so my point there is, right, he had achieved calm abiding, right? That's the implication here. He had achieved deep meditative concentration and calm abiding. And then it says, this is the part that's relevant to our current point. It says here, describing this period of his life, Gyawa and Sapa said that at that time, if he looked at a mountain, he could count even the most minute constituent particles of it. And it once happened that while he was living at Gepel, a particular place in Tibet, he left his room at dawn and walked through the walls of many adjoining rooms without obstruction, and all there had been amazed. So there comes part of the point here that the reason why I brought up Gyawa and Sapa, this passage, right, is it's describing how after Gyawa and Sapa achieved calm abiding and sort of stayed in retreat for a long time, meditating, right, he achieved this level of experience, of meditative experience, right, where he would look at a mountain and he could sort of see the individual particles, it says the smallest particles, right, of that mountain. Now, Gyawa and Sapa was a Madhyamaka practitioner, so he wasn't a follower of the Vaibhashika school. But the point is that he achieved a meditative experience where objects no longer seem solid to him, right? And he could perceive the what's it called? The subatomic particles, you can call them, right? That are constituents of matter through his meditation. And he's not unique in that. Many Buddhist texts describe, this is not something that's the experience of an ordinary person, right? But somebody who's already achieved calm abiding, right? That they have these kinds of experiences where they can see subatomic things, and then this idea of like the 1/120th of a finger snap. That's what they're getting at, is these kinds of yogis perceive, because their meditative concentration is so precise, when they look at their own experience of consciousness, they can and part of what they're getting at here, so when they say 1/120th, why do they, or 1/165th, or one text says 100 and something, why are they saying that, actually, right? What they're saying is that was the experience of yogis, actually, right? That sometimes a yogi who achieved calm abiding and then was focusing on sort of noticing if they focus on objects, they could perceive the subatomic structure. If they focused on their own consciousness, they could, and it's actually interesting, isn't it? When we just did the mindfulness of breathing, right? Like, we could maybe be aware of an out breath and an in breath. Right? Some people can't, actually. Some people, if they, I've had that experience many times. Where I sit down with somebody to try to explain like mindfulness to them, and they can't keep their consciousness there for longer than for a full breath. Right? Some of you can keep your consciousness there for 10 breaths, maybe. So that's an achievement. Anyway, these people who we're describing now, right, who this school would call Aryas, when they look at consciousness, they can actually perceive these, let's say 1/120th of a finger snap. So when they're watching their consciousness moment to moment, that's their level of precision in their self. We say, I'm being introspective, right? Their level of introspection is different than ours, right? they can see what's going on in their own consciousness, each 1/120th of a finger snap.
But Gyawa and Sapa can still identify those particles as a mountain, right?
Yeah.
He's looking at a mountain, he sees nothing but particles, but he knows it's a mountain. So
Yeah.
what truth is that?
So the mountain would be the conventional truth. So he knows conventional truth, and that's it. From this school's perspective. Now he's not saying Gyawa and Sapa, because he was a Majamaka, wouldn't say that's my ultimate truth. But from this school's perspective, he can perceive the mountain, and then he can perceive the particles, right? So the particles would be, from this school's perspective, an ultimate truth object.
So my mala, I got my mala, and it breaks, or I cut the string, and then I put all the pieces in a plastic bag. That's my mala still, right? So with the mind apprehending, the disappearance of the mind apprehending my mala isn't really disappearing. It's still identifiable as my mala.
Actually, and you'd have to, so I guess it's an interesting point, isn't it? At what point, what I would sort of raise to you to think about, because they're getting the experience is canceled, right? And so, like, actually, I have when you said that, it made me smile, because I have a few bags like that in my house in various places, old malas that I haven't yet put back together. And it's an interesting point, right? Because up to that point, I would still look at the bag and say, that's my mala, right? But then, like, at what point, let's say, like, you've lost a bead, and then if you've lost 5 beads, and then if some of the beads got stepped on or something, at what point would you say
my old mala?
It's no longer?
It's still my old mala.
What if you threw it in a fire and it turned into ash? Then you wouldn't see it as your mala anymore, at some point.
That's what I was going to say. Particularly when family members are cremated, while they're lying in wait, they're still them. And it is the cremation, now the ashes that we have. If my brother-in-law here in my home I don't feel like that's him. But when we were up until the moment of the cremation, until we had the ashes, that was still him. For me, I don't know. It just feels like a matter of perception.
So, Lauren, would I be right to say that the Vaibhashika would reject Avalokiteshvara and the Heart Sutra saying form is emptiness as nihilism?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
That's exactly right. Yeah, if you said to them, form is emptiness, they would say that's definitely nihilism.
Okay.
Form is not, and that you're being a nihilist. That would be their.
I can't help but, like, when you describe them seeing, like, the smallest particles of things and, like, being able to go through walls, it sounds a little like Neo in the Matrix.
Well,
Yeah.
to get back,
I wonder if they studied some of this stuff when they made that scene, because it reminds me of it so much.
Yeah.
well, to get back to my original question, just to make my quote final point unquote, the nice stories that I don't want that to sound critical, that have been told, they're like appeals to authority, which of course I have a real problem with. So I'll leave it there. Those don't seem to be useful axioms to me. So.
No, that's fair. I guess I'll say a couple points though. One is I think it is useful if you want to understand the school to understand that this is their way of. We don't have to agree with them, and ultimately, like, even the mind-only school, and various other schools refute these ideas of directionally partless particles. They say they don't exist, for example, and they say what's the word that also temporally partless moments of consciousness don't exist. So other Buddhist schools disagree with this school on those points. But if we're trying to put ourselves in the mind of this school for a moment, one point is, they are saying, those must exist. Otherwise, and actually to get it, like, I think it's important what Ryan just raised, just if you want to understand this school, to think about what Ryan just said, right? To go, like, from this school's perspective, if you were to say consciousness is empty, right? This school would say you've fallen into nihilism. You're saying nothing exists, and that's dangerous. And one point is just that's useful to understand this school. That's one point. The other point, the reason why I quoted Gyawa and Sapa in part is, it's an interesting point Paul made, right? Like, one way of using that is to appeal to authority. But I think it's useful in a different way, which is something I was getting at last time, which is that if you continue meditating, right? If you practice enough, this is part of the benefit for Gyawan Sapa of having studied tenets, right? He had that experience, right? Can you imagine, like, that'd be wild, right? Like if you're in a retreat and suddenly you look at a tree, you might think, wow, like I've something amazing has happened. And maybe that's the ultimate truth, right? And part of the benefit to Gyawan Sapa is when he had this meditative experience, he could know, oh, great, whatever, that's good, but that's not the ultimate truth. Not according to the Majjhimakas, right? In other words, so he knew, so part of, I guess, what I'm getting at is one way of viewing the Vaibhashika sort of presentation of these objects is that if you continue practicing, you may have those experiences and you can know, oh, the Vaibhashikas would call that ultimate truth, but it's not the actual ultimate truth. So that's another use of knowing all of this is one thing I'm pointing out. Lynn has a...
Yeah, I think this is more a metaphor, analogy, but it's like, it seems like you're holding both experiences in the same moment. And it's interesting to me that they think there's no difference between the past, the present, and the future. All time is one. So it's almost like if you look at a piece of art, and if you're an artist or you understand the piece of art, you're going to see the balance, you're going to see the colors, the bright and the dark. You're going to see all that stuff simultaneously with seeing the whole of the picture. I mean, it's really hard to do if you don't know art, or you're not taught, or you're not conscious of all that. But an artist would look at a piece differently than I would, for example, unless somebody explained all of it to me. But they see the piece of art fundamentally different than I would, unless somebody explained a lot of stuff to me. So it's almost like they would see all the components, the balance, the colors, the light and dark, simultaneously with seeing the whole of the picture. And that seems to me similar to what they're saying, is there's a simultaneous apprehension of the conventional truth and the ultimate truth. It's at the same time.
That's interesting. I guess I'll say a few things. Like one is just being a little bit, because we're studying this newly and it's a specific tenet system. One point I'll say is like, in terms of time, what the point you made early on in your comment, like I think here it says the three times are asserted to be substances. A pot is asserted also to exist, also at the time of the past pot and the time of the future pot. There, I just want to make sure it's precise. There's my just to make sure people understand that, so they're not saying that time doesn't exist or something like that. What they're really saying there is that, their view, I guess, is because the pot is substantially established, as long as the pot, that pot exists, from the moment it was created until the moment it's destroyed, it exists. But they would still say it's impermanent and it's existing in time, and that there comes a point where, and if it's a pot, which is a conventional truth object, there's a point where it will be destroyed, because all things that arise due to causes and conditions eventually fall apart. So their assertion is really that, and we gave the example before of gold, right? The gold that existed in the, gold exists in the past, in the present, and the future, and there's a kind of substance there that's, it's impermanent, but it exists in the three times. So, I'm just making sure that's clear. And then the other point, I guess, is interesting question. Like there is that's an interesting question. Like, because part of what you're getting at in a way is a different question. I'm just sort of contemplating it together for a moment. What is it like in this school to see the ultimate truth? Right? That's part of what you're raising, right? is like, and I think that's an interesting question, right? Like that Jetsun Chogi Gelsen doesn't directly talk about, does he? He doesn't sort of talk about that, right? But we said only Aryas see the ultimate truth, according to this school, right? And so I would actually ask you to contemplate that, right? What is it like in this school for a Vaibhashika to see the ultimate truth? And I want to raise one philosophical point here that's worth, that's going to be important throughout various schools. And I think, Lynn, your comment kind of hints at this, that's why I'm bringing it up, is it's a very important point, like Lama Tsongkhapa emphasizes when he teaches the Madhyamaka school, right? And so Tsongkhapa makes this very clear, strong point that in the Prasangika Madhyamaka school, emptiness is a non-affirming negation, right? Or a mere negation, we sometimes call it. And so I want to, I've mentioned it in other classes, but I want to explain what that is, right? So a mere negation or a non-affirming negation is a negation that doesn't imply a positive phenomena, right? So and the example the example there is things lack inherent existence is a mere negation. Right? It's not implying that they exist. It's not implying anything else other than that they lack that. Here, right? And so the point, like when lamas teach on the Madhyamaka school, right? They often point this out. They say, so the experience of emptiness, now I'm talking about the Madhyamaka school, right? The experience of emptiness in the Madhyamaka school is a mere negation, right? Or is a space-like emptiness. And space-like, they use the metaphor of space because space is a negation, right? Space we talk about as a lack of obstruction, right? And so they talk about emptiness in that school being this experience. That's why we talk about there are all these English terms, voidness, or what is it called? Emptiness, or whatever, all those kinds of terms, right? Here, right, the ultimate truth is not a mere negation, right? Because it implies, in other words, the ultimate truth here implies existence, right? It implies a phenomenon, right? It implies a directionally partless particle, right? So in this school, the ultimate truth is not just a negation, it's assertion, right? A temporarily partless moment of consciousness, right? Does that make sense? So it's not a mere vacuity, you could say. It's an assertion of a positive existent.
Well, it's sort of like what we struggle with, which is different than what we struggled with in the Madhyamaka school, which was emptiness is a negation of consciousness. It's an analytical thinking. It's a negation. It's different. It switches from analytical thinking into emptiness. And we all struggled with, does that happen simultaneously? And I think Jody's not here today, but she said, well, maybe it's just a little bit before. And it was really, I think for many of us, hard to sort of comprehend what that sort of meant. But it's sort of the same thing, except this school doesn't believe that happens. It believes you keep the analytical at the same time as you keep the ultimate truth, I guess.
Although this school would say that there comes a point in the ultimate truth where it's a direct perception, where it's you're no longer engaging in analysis, right? You're directly perceiving, let's say, the directionally partless particle. But so it becomes a direct perception of that. But what's the way to say this right? But
it's a perception, not emptiness. It's a perception of something.
Yeah, it's right. It's a perception of the ultimate truth in that case, right? Which would be, for example, this directionally partless particle, or so it's they would say it's a direct perception of something in meditative concentration, in a state, that the yogi of this is in deep meditation, right? The person has achieved calm abiding and is meditating on, the ultimate one would be meditation on the selflessness of persons they're doing, right? Which we'll get to in a while, but so they're meditating, so for example, on the selflessness of persons, and And they might come to where they perceive just like, actually, I want to just share, imagine it, right? Imagine this person, like, because these yogis meditate on selflessness, right? With calm abiding. So actually, it is an important point, right? The yogi of this school is a remarkable being, right? It's somebody who's achieved calm abiding and then is meditating, for example, on like the lack of a substantially existent independent person, independent person of themselves, right? And if they keep meditating on that, right, they would eventually come to a point where they can perceive, right, that, they perceive that kind of selflessness, but what's left over for them is the perception of particles, right, their body, and what's left over is their experience of individual moments of consciousness. And for them, those are truly existent, right? And those are substantially existent, ultimately existent. But they would realize experientially in that moment that and actually, can you imagine the profundity of that? That person would have this experience, right? In deep meditative concentration, it's not the Madhyamaka's experience, just clarifying that, right? But they would have this experience that there is no substantially existent, substantially existent, independently existent person. And they would have this experience, all that's left for them would be these individual, let's say they're focusing on mind, right? So for them, they would experience, but there are these discrete moments of consciousness that are 1/120th of a finger snap, and in that they would have a direct realization that there's no substantially existent me. Right? Like that's a remarkable meditative experience. And that would be, so that's an example of what that might be like, right? Like for this yogi. And that for this school, that person would have perceived the ultimate truth then, right? Which is, and there is, if they're meditating on selflessness, there is a negation there, right? It's a negation of, in this case, let's say a substantially existent self, right? But there's something left over for them, which is what Ryan was getting at earlier, right? There is, the Heart Sutra says, also no form, also no consciousness, right? These people would say that would be nihilism. Consciousness does exist. I often think that, like, I said it's useful to think of different, like I often thought that when I was, remember there was like, I don't know how many of you saw it, but many years ago, or no, not many, like more than a decade ago, right? Psychiatrist in New York, Mark Epstein, wrote that book, Thoughts Without a Thinker. And I remember when that book came out, I bought it, because I'm a therapist, I was curious. And I remember I kept looking at the title and thinking, oh, what's he getting at? Thoughts Without a Thinker, right? Like Avalokiteshvara in the Heart Sutra would say, what are you talking about? There's no more reality status to thoughts than there are to the thinker, right? Right? In other words, just as the self is empty, consciousness is empty, right? But then if you look at it from this school, what he was saying was very Buddhist, wasn't it? Right? This school would say the ultimate truth is thoughts without a thinker, right? There is no ultimate truth thinker, but there are ultimate truth moments of consciousness. So it's like his title was Buddhist, it just wasn't Madhyamaka, if that makes sense. So if you understand tenets, you can see how, like, there are different ways, these are all Buddhist views, right? But there are different Buddhist views.
So would a person in this school, if he realizes what they're getting at, what you just explained, would that person then be considered enlightened, or by that school, and would he be considered enlightened by the other schools?
Really interesting question, right? So, like, from this school's perspective, the person who has that meditative experience would be considered enlightened. They would be considered an arhat, right? Or an arya, at least an arya, let's put it that way, right? Somebody saw that, they would be considered an a noble being who's seen the ultimate truth and is a stream enterer, right? At least, if not a, it's right there for, according to this school, we'll get to that later. It's actually in the text. There are different levels of realization of enlightenment. But yeah, they would be, you could say there's like stream enterer and once returner and non-returner and arhat, but they would be considered one of those levels of enlightenment already and on their way to arhatship. From a Majjhimaka perspective, like actually recently, I was sometimes listening to those live stream teachings by the Dalai Lama, and he often says this. He says, there's a quote where Chandrakirti, right, who's the main proponent, one of the main proponents of the Prasangika school, he says, even great scholars, and so he says he's referring to like Vasubandhu and Dinaga and Dharmakirti. And he says, even some great scholars, because they don't have the imprints to understand emptiness, failed to understand it. Right. So from Chandrakirti's perspective, those great yogis who in this school would be considered stream enters, from Chandrakirti's perspective, he would say, no, they're wonderful scholars, they're wonderful practitioners, but they haven't yet understood the ultimate truth. So that would be that's what his point is. From the Prasangika perspective, they would look at those people and say, oh, they're wonderful Buddhist practitioners, but no, they've not yet, they haven't yet gotten there to the ultimate truth. So they're not enlightened, although they could be wonderful scholars, for example.
Could they be then one of the bhumis? Would they be considered bodhisattvas?
No, I mean, to be on the, from the Prasangika perspective, to be on the bhumis means you've seen emptiness directly. It means you already are a stream enter or an arya. If you're on the bhumis, it means you've seen emptiness directly. So they would say, those actually from a Majjhimaka perspective, you could say, you would look at somebody like that and say, well, they might be if they have bodhicitta, they might be on the path of preparation. So the path of preparation is somebody who's achieved. Well, at the minimum, actually, it depends how you think about it, doesn't it? At the minimum, you could say they're on the path. They're practitioners on the path. And if they don't have bodhicitta, then they would be like, they would be on the path of individual liberation. If they have bodhicitta, they would be on the Mahayana path. But from a Prasangika perspective, only somebody who's seen emptiness directly can be on the bhumis, because that means they're a noble being, an arya, bodhisattva. Sujata, you had something also.
I think I might be jumping ahead, but my confusion is, thank you, Lauren. And I don't understand how the selflessness is argued when these Aryas reach the point where they, the self then would be, a collection of directionally partless particles, this 120th of a finger snap. I still feel like there would be a self there, right? Even if you could get down to that level of, granularity of the identity would still be there. So maybe that gets covered in just ways of asserting selflessness, given that there are these fundamentally, micro particles and moments of consciousness. But I think I'm having trouble understanding how, but I think that I might just be asking questions that come later on about how selflessness is asserted, given that there's going to be this reality of what we currently perceive to be the self, right?
Yeah, and I guess one thing you're getting at in a way is trying to find the actual. Yeah, one point you were getting at, I think, I just want to ask you, Sujata, I want to ask you something related to what you were saying. I'm trying to say this the right way. Like in terms, obviously there is a section in this on assertions of selflessness, so we'll go into more detail then. But one thing I think you're getting at maybe is, this is right. They usually use this phrase, right? What is the illustration of a person, right? According to a given school. And what they're getting at in a way is all these schools, It's actually interesting, isn't it? Because according to this school, like there are two levels. Actually, I don't know if I should go into this now. Maybe it'll confuse, but I'll just say briefly. Like according to this school, right, there are two levels of selflessness. There's the gross level of selflessness, which is a refutation of a, what's it called, a partless or a unitary, independent. What is it called? Unitary. Oh, I'm forgetting the last phrase. Unitary. Yeah, so like that there is no partless, permanent, that's it. No partless, permanent, independent self. And then there's a refutation of the subtle selflessness, that there's no substantially existent independent self, right? And so the right phrasing. Anyway, I'm forgetting the exact phrasing, but it's basically that. And then, so that's what they're refuting, right? But they're not refuting, because I think I'm just wondering if what part of your confusion is, they're not refuting an inherently existent self. That's not, in other words, they would never ask that question. Like, and it's interesting because actually maybe that actually leads back to something about this part, which I hope that helps with your point. But I'll go into that more now here in terms of the two truths, right? Because actually that was something I wanted to cover. Yeah, this time. Good. Let me pull up my note on that point. So from this school's perspective, and I think what Sujata asked is getting it, to understand it's useful to get into this part now, is this is kind of interesting, and it's hard. If you've studied Madhyamaka, it's going to, it takes thought. From this school's perspective, conventional truths are truly existent. They truly exist, right? So a tree is truly existent. A forest is truly existent. A vase is truly existent, right? A woolen cloth is truly existent. Also, according to this school, conventional truths are substantially established, they say. This is tricky now, but are not substantially existent. And what they mean by that is that substantially established means they do have their own substance. Does that make sense? So like let's say a clay vase is made of clay. It's made up of atoms of clay. It's substantially existent in that sense, right? It has its own substance. A gold pot is substantially established in the sense that it's made up of, it has its own substance of goldness. Right? But conventional truths are not ultimately existent. Right? What does that mean according to the school? It means they can be canceled out. The consciousness of them can be canceled out if you break it down into parts. Right? And one other term they use for conventional existence, which again, I'm actually being confusing a little bit on purpose here, but because this is the hard work of understanding tenets, is conventional truths according to this school are imputedly existent. But imputedly existent doesn't mean what it means according to the, right? That's what, actually, this is why if you ever study with the Tibetan Gelugpa Lama anyway, they'll use the term merely imputed. And this is why they use the word merely. Does that make sense? According to the process, and actually you want to, this is why I say it's useful to understand tenets if you want to really understand Madhyamaka, actually. I've said that a few times now, and now I'm saying it again. And this is partly why, is what's the difference between something being imputedly existent and something being merely imputed? And if you want to understand Madhyamaka, you have to understand that difference in a way, in some sense, right? Because this school would say conventional truth objects are imputedly existent, but they're not merely imputedly existent. Whereas there is something there from its own side, right? The Prasangikas would say merely imputed, meaning there's nothing there from its own side. This school says it's imputedly existent, but it's not merely imputed. There is something there from its own side, right? There's a substance there from its own side. Does that make sense? It's different. Those are two different things. Ryan has.
I don't want to drag this out if you're trying to move on, but
No, it's okay.
Bouncing off of Sujata's comment. So understand, what a basic particle, would be. Are we saying, when an artist sees a mountain as a collection of minute particles, is it because those minute particles, they don't bear, at that basic level, they're not mountain particles, they're just particles. Yeah. And so, at a person, at a level of a self, you can break down a person to the level of particles, but they're not Ryan particles, they're just particles. And we then later impute Ryan onto. Is that understanding that right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's right. And you can see then how you can see from Ryan what you just said, that there's a sense in which there's something that's not ultimately true, right? Like there's something that's not ultimately existent, Ryan, right? And then but then in this school, you're not negating everything, right? You're saying, but there are still the particles, there are still the moments, and those are ultimately existent. So it's not nihilism. That's this. I think you're getting at the subtlety of this school's presentation there. Yeah. And then bring up now ultimate truths a little bit more, right? Which I said are only seen by Aryas, right? And so ultimate truths, right, like conventional truths, they're substantially established, meaning they have their own substance, but they're ultimately existent, right? Now remember, that's different, isn't it? The Prasangikas would say nothing is ultimately, even emptiness itself is not ultimately existent, right? That's a Prasangika view. This school doesn't say that. This school says ultimate truths are ultimately existent. And then this school also would say that ultimate truths are substantially existent, right? Meaning that, what's I say? That they exist, again, that they exist from their own side, that they have their own substance, and that they're not, what's the word? That there's no way to break them down further, right? There's no way to further break them down and cancel out the consciousness perceiving them. So in that sense, they're ultimates. Yeah, I just want to pause. Again, any questions? Because I know this is, I mean, actually, this is supposed to be a little challenge, right? This is supposed to challenge us to think, but any questions? Any other questions about that? Actually, I want to ask you guys a question then, like just to think about, again, just to encourage thought, because we could just move on. And sometimes I think when these are taught, you just move on them, right? But I just think it's worth contemplating a little bit is, let's say this right, like, well, let's say this way, like, so if this school, we said at the very beginning, this school does not teach an emptiness of phenomena, right? This school says, phenomena are truly existent. It teaches selflessness of persons, but not self, right? Mahayana schools teach selflessness of phenomena, but these schools that aim at individual liberation or associate with the individual liberation vehicle or whatever, they don't teach selflessness of phenomena, right? So, they only teach a selflessness of persons. So here's my question to you, right? How is if in this school's presentation, how is a mountain not selfless? Why is a mountain not selfless? Or why is a tree not selfless? You see, I'm just asking the questions because, like, what I'm getting at, you don't have to know the answer perfectly or something like that. But these are the things we have to, if you want to really understand tenets or just sort of understand, again, like, what's the difference? Because remember I said, if you don't know the difference between this and the Majjhimaka school, then you don't really understand. Then we don't really understand the Majjhimaka school. Does that make sense? So if we're saying, well, so I'm just going to ask that, right? Like, so this school's saying, well, a tree is made up of particles. right? And it's not ultimately a tree, right? This school could say that, right? There is a tree's ultimate nature is not, it's not ultimately a tree, right? Because it's only conventionally a tree. So why is that not selflessness of tree? Why is the tree not, why is that not saying the tree has no self or no nature?
Are they simply concerned with the mind and not the body of everything else?
Mhm.
It's still grasping at something. There's still it's still asserting something. Just not the tree, but there's some grasping to something. Actually, I do have a question.
Okay.
So in this school then, do they, when they're meditating on negating the self, do they meditate in the way that Madhyamaka would, which is do they establish the object to be negated in the same way Madhyamaka would to negate the self? It's a
Good
question.
question, right? Yeah, like this, it's an interesting question, right? This school's object of negation would be different. But again, like I think Cynthia, your question is great, right? Because we have to, like, how is it different? That's a hard question, right? Like, for sure it's different, right? But what I would challenge us to think about is, well, how is it different? Wow. Like, and this is where it starts, right? In other words, then if we don't know how it's different, and I guess what I'm starting with is this, is like, in one way, when we're at the very beginning, of meditating on emptiness, it's a very, we start with whatever we can start with, right? And that's okay. Right? And like in those examples where you start off with think of the time you were most insulted in your life, right? And how you felt in that moment, your sense of self, right? When somebody really said something terrible to you, right? And then you think, does that self exist? And that's extremely useful, right? But actually, then if you ask, here, if we're studying tenets, you might start to go, if you're actually doing that meditation, good, just do it. It's good. It's a good thing to do, right? But then if you start to ask the question, once you study tenets, well, wait a second, what level, if I look at my experience of that self when I was insulted, which level of grossness of self are we talking about, right? Because if you look at it, right, from let me point out from what I said earlier, right, there are different levels of self that are refuted, right? There's the unitary, I said it earlier, unitary, independent, permanent self, right? That's grosser than the substantially existent self-existent self. Does that make sense? That's a subtler object to be negated. A substantially existent self. Did I earlier say self-existent? So substantially existent self-existent self, according to this school, would be this school's subtle object to be refuted. But this school doesn't refute an inherently existent self, which is a different object to be refuted, right? So, which is even subtler. And I just think it's an important question. On the one hand, I'm sort of trying to be sensitive to this point, though, right? At the very beginning, to find any object of negation is useful, isn't it? Like, in other words, but then as you continue meditating on selflessness, and I think your question is really good, so that what we have to do then is look more and more carefully and get more, over time, we have to get more and more sort of precise. What am I negating? What is that experience? And to find these different objects of negation in our own experience is quite challenging in a way at the beginning, isn't it? And I guess I'll make one other point just about that, just because hope maybe it'll be helpful since you asked, Cynthia. Like, is some scholars, there are different opinions on this, but some scholars in the commentaries say that so I said this school has a gross object of negation and of selflessness and a subtle object, right? So the gross one, which was what I say the partless, or you could say unitary, permanent, independent self, right? That's refuted. This school says that self is not, usually most scholars of the school, I think there might be exceptions, I'm not really sure, but most scholars of the school seem to say that self is acquired. We've used that term before, in the sense that sense of self, that's like, a self that's unitary and independent and permanent, is an acquired view of self, which means like, so for example, if a person were raised in a religion where they were taught that as a child, right, that there's your soul, guard your soul or guard your whatever, something like that, then that's like, it could be it could be kind of something that just comes up for us, but it was sort of trained into us in some sense, right? Either in past lives or in this life. It was sort of an acquired sense of self. Whereas in this school, the substantially existent self, it can also be, there can also be an acquired version of that, but the more important one of that is innate, they would say. In other words, that's sort of common to animals, it's common to, you don't have to be human even to have that one. That's the root of samsara, according to this school. Does that make sense? So that's a deeper, more, it's not just acquired through study, because that's an important point too, isn't it? If you read texts about Buddhism, there are some lines in texts where they were clearly, they were refuting acquired intellectual ideas about a self, right? So somebody says you're eternal soul, right, or whatever. Like, there are many Buddhist texts that are challenging that idea, right? But that's an intellectually acquired idea, right? But then the feeling of a substantially existent self, right? That feels like it, we often say that one, right? Like in this school, they would say this also. It feels like it's the owner of the body. When we, no, you don't have to be intellectually acquired. When somebody hits you and you say, you just hit my face, I'm upset with you, right? That's not intellectually acquired. That feeling of my face, that's not acquired, right? That's an innate sense of self, right? If somebody comes up and slaps you or something on the back and you turn around like this, there's no intellectually acquired thing there, right? You're immediately feeling like, hey, you just hit my body, you hit me, either one, right? And that sense of my body, who is the owner, right? Or that sense of meanness, how am I my body? That's me. That's an innate sense of self, right? And what I would just ask us to think about is, part of what you will get into as we go along in Tenets is, so when are we grasping at a intellectually acquired sense of self? When are we grasping at a substantially existent, self-existent sense of self? And then when are we grasping at an, actually there are different ones, right? A truly existent sense of self, which is actually something that's a selflessness asserted by the Svatantrika Madhyamikas. And then when are we grasping at an inherently existent sense of self, which is the object of negation according to the Prasangikas? Anyway, so Cynthia, your question is very deep, is my point, isn't it? It's like they're all different objects of negation. According to Prasangikas, if you refute the most subtle, then all of them are refuted. But part of what we're getting at, in a way, I'll ask this as a question too, just to think about, is, can we negate the most subtle one if you can't negate the grosser ones? And I think most people have to start with the grosser ones, don't we? And then gradually get more subtle to identify it and find it. There may be exceptional people, who realized emptiness in a past life, and somebody says one word to them and they realize it. There are stories like that or something. But for most of us, we start with grosser levels, and then it's like what we say, peeling an onion or something. It's like layers, that go in and in and in until you find the empty center of the onion. Does that sort of answer your question, Listen? Did I get it? Okay. And again, I just want to say, like, I just want to go back to what I said earlier, and then we can move on. But I just want to go back and say also that that's why I was getting at, like, remember this. So this, you have this idea, right? Ultimate truths in this school are these phenomena that cannot be, where the consciousness of them, the awareness of them is not lost by breaking them down. It can't be lost by breaking them into parts. Conventional truths, it can be lost. Right? But remember, part of this school, and I'm just pointing this out, right? This school does teach a selflessness of persons, as we were just talking about, on 2 levels of subtlety, but it does not teach an emptiness of phenomena, right? And so from this school's perspective, phenomena are truly existent, right? They are substantially established, right? So even conventional truth objects are substantially established and are truly existent. They're not empty, but they're not ultimate truths either. So it's subtle. What do we mean? It's really, it's a subtle point. They're not, like, a tree is not an ultimate truth in this school, but a tree is truly existent. If you were to say, and again, like Ryan caught, right? If you were to say in this school, all trees are empty, this school would say, you're denying functionality. Trees function, and actually you could see how, one Geshe in his commentary said, if you were to debate with, a proponent of this school, you might lose. Even if you say I'm a Madhyamaka fault, right? If you were to really debate with somebody from the school, they would say, they have many good arguments, right? They would say, well, wait a second, trees function. What do you mean they're empty? If you were to say, well, they're mere dependent arisings or something, right? This school would say, yeah, but if they're dependent, they depend on something, right? They can't depend on nothing. What do you mean dependent? Yes, they're dependent, but dependent on things, right? On parts, and those parts exist. Are you saying, how can you say, in this school, if you said, oh, they're mere dependent arising, this school would say, what are you talking about? Like, you're saying it depends, but it depends on something that doesn't exist? That's ridiculous, right? How can you say it depends, but it depends on something that doesn't exist? That has no meaning. You're self-contradicting. They would say you're contradicting yourself. You've lost the debate, right? My point is, like, we're used to, of course you can, there are ways to refute some of the positions of this school, but you can, if you think about this school for a little while, you can see, like, you can see where they're coming from. Let's put it that way. And actually, to just one last point I'll make, and then I'll move on, is also to respect. I want to go back to something Paul said, which I think was getting at something important from this school. This school also would say, in a way, like, about objects. This school does teach that objects are truly existent, like trees and houses and so on, right? But this school, in a way, would say, if you were to say, well, even the question of are they in some sense empty or something, one is they don't teach they're empty, but the other is, from this school's perspective, they would say, that's not what's important. This school would say, your mental afflictions are what's important. Your hatred, right? Your anger, your desire, your pride, that's important. And how do you overcome that? You have to realize the selflessness of yourself. Does that make sense? And then you'll overcome your mental afflictions, and that's what matters. So don't worry about it. This school would say that, in a sense. Your questions of, this school, if somebody were saying, well, isn't emptiness empty, or isn't whatever, one sense the school would say that's nihilistic, but the school, I think, also would tend to say, those aren't the core of the issue. The core of the issue is your self-grasping. That's what the school focuses on, right? Grasping at a substantially existent, self-existent self. And that's what you have to realize the selflessness of in order to overcome your mental afflictions. So that I think, Paul, you were hinting at that, but this school sort of doesn't emphasize those points, the points of, and even the question of, like, this school just really focuses on, that's the Buddha's insight. That's what the Buddha taught. That's what we have to realize. Anatman, that idea, anatman, that there is no selflessness, we translate that as, right? That's this school's focus. Okay, so that's really the question. That's this school, so we that's what Jetson Chogi-Gelton covers here in his presentation of their ways of asserting objects, right? So they're permanent and impermanent objects, or they're conventional truth and ultimate truth objects. And then we'll just start in. We have just, we have a little bit of time. So we'll start in at the next section is section 5, which again appears in all the 4 sections of this text. And that is the way of asserting object possessors. And I just wanted to even pause there to reflect together on something, which is, and if you've listened to Buddhist teachings, you hear this kind, right? We either say this term object possessors, or sometimes translators will say subjects, right? The object, subject and object, or object possessor. So what is a subject, or what is an object possessor, right? So that means consciousness, right? And even that, right? Like, I just want to pause there just to reflect together for a moment. Like that these are the categories, right? Ways of asserting objects and ways of asserting object possessors. And just the fact that that's part of the structure of every section of this text, right? I just want to point that out. Like, I just want to point out that there's something significant about that we could miss. And that is, right, like, that's so fundamental to all the schools, right? So the Buddhist worldview is that there is a relationality between objects and object possessors, right? Between objects of consciousness and consciousness. And the reason why I'm pointing that out is, I guess I'll say it this way. If you grew up in the US, right, like, actually, it's funny. Like, I'm thinking of my own, like, I'll ask it this way, like, from kindergarten through the end of high school, I don't think I ever had I can't remember, maybe I missed it, maybe I'm not remembering it, but I can't remember anybody ever mentioning this category, consciousness, right? Everything I studied, actually, I believe everything I studied, pretty much, maybe kindergarten was the exception. I have to say first grade. Kindergarten, they might have, actually, I'm not sure. But I think from first grade through the end of high school, I can't remember, like, there was a ton of study, right, about really it was grounded in European, right, and then American views of objects, right? Whether it was history, right, if you think of all the subjects, history, right, mathematics, science, what's the other? Social studies or whatever, literature. Mostly all the classes were studying objects, right? And there was, actually, it's funny, isn't it? Like, and if you were growing up in a, if you go to the, if you get a Buddhist education, right, the main subject is object possessors. The main area of interest is consciousness. Right? And so I'm just pointing out, even the mere fact that this is part of every chapter, this structure, reflects a difference in Buddhist culture as compared to as compared to European and American culture, which don't emphasize consciousness much at all. So I just wanted to point that out. John has.
Lauren?
Yeah, John. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah. From the other side of the puddle. Yeah, that's actually consistent if you look at teaching, even in actual schools. If you have a child in school in China, they actually do think, I mean, I've had friends who had their kids go to schools over there, and they talk about how different they are when they're in Hong Kong or in Singapore. Even the American schools or the international schools have a whole different approach to everything being material, which is what we think of in North America or Europe, versus not everything being material if you're in Asia.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So it's a fundamental educational philosophical difference. I mean, the first time most of us saw a philosophy course was when we got to college.
Yeah. Yeah, that's yeah, and that's so I think it is. It's I mean that's a yeah, it's a difference. I guess I agree, and that's why I just wanted to point it out, because I think it's so fundamental. I think it's so fundamental to Buddhism to look at consciousness. I think it's so fundamental. At least I mean, I can only, I don't have as much experience of, but I can definitely say, if I look back, this culture that I'm sitting, where I'm literally sitting in the country, doesn't do a good job of looking at that, and it sort of, it's not been an area of study or of interest, really, for the most part. And I think, I hope that, that's starting to change a little bit, but it's slow. I often say that being I think like, philosophers look some at that with, and, what is it, 120 years of Freud, since Freud started the area of psychology, but that's, anyway, it's not been an area that's been studied a lot. If you think of how much money goes into the study of objects as compared to object possessors, it's a very big difference. And that makes sense, John, that's different in other cultures. Okay, yeah, we still have some time. So come back now. So in terms of object possessors, he starts off here. He says there are various. So remember, he categorized that there were. He categorized early on in section 2 that in terms of the Vaibhashikas, right? You can categorize them as there are 3 divisions or 18 divisions. Usually, here he asserted them as 3: the Kashmiris, those are the Western region, and those are the Central region. In a more detailed way, you can do 18, and I said that the 18 are in detail in Jeffrey Hopkins' books. But he starts off here, Destin Chogyeltsin, by talking about, I'll just read what he says first. There are various assertions. Most of the 18 sub-schools assert the mere collection of the 5 aggregates to be the illustration of the person. There are proponents of great exposition from the Western region assert the mental consciousness to be the illustration of the person, and so forth. The Kashmiris assert the continuum of the aggregates to be the illustration of the person. So a couple of points. These are actually, this is good. It's really getting at core philosophical things that that are good to think about. And also they come up if you go to Dharma classes. A lot of these points come up, and if you haven't studied tenets, then you just don't know. Do you ever have that experience? Like, there's so many times where if you're listening to like a Tibetan Lama, there are some points where they start to say something and you just don't know what they're talking about, right? And it just goes by. It just goes by your mind because it's like, I don't know what they're talking about. And part of that is because they're coming from this, they're mentioning things that come from these sort of core ideas in Buddhist philosophy. And if, it's just like, sometimes we have gaps, I guess, in our study of the context. And so if you have a gap, then you don't know what they're, then they'll say something that sort of they assume, or might reasonably assume you would be familiar with, but you may not be familiar with it if you didn't study these. So anyway, that's a lot of these things we're going to cover are like that. And so one is, in terms of object possessors, actually I was imprecise here a few minutes ago, because actually you could say, one point is, you can say an object possessor is a consciousness, or you can say it's a person. Does that make sense? Like, because, so in other words, who perceive, like if you say, if you're talking about a tree, right? You could say the person saw the tree, or you could say the I consciousness saw the tree, or you could say the mental consciousness apprehended the tree, right? And if we say an apprehended is probably a better word, right? So you could say a person apprehended a tree, you could say an I consciousness apprehended a tree, you could say a mental consciousness apprehended a tree. I suppose actually if you're listening to the rustling of leaves, you could say an ear consciousness apprehended a tree, couldn't you? So there are all different ways of apprehending, and there are different apprehenders, right, or subjects. I'm going to use the word subjects for a moment. If the object is a tree, those are all different subjects, right? You could say the person is a subject, you could say ear conscious is a subject, eye conscious is a subject, or mental consciousness is a subject. So here, in terms of, he's getting at this point, and again, he's saying this word, how does he say, illustration of the person, right? And so, if you study Buddhist philosophy, that comes up, this idea of what is the illustration of a person. And there's a chart that from FPMT, there it is, that goes, I'll actually, so And so it's an interesting phrase, right? What do you point, illustration is like, what do you point to, right? When you start talking about a person, what do you point to, or what illustrates that? And there are different Buddhist tenet systems assert different things as the illustration of a person. So, as he says here, most assert, as he says here, the mere collection of the 5 aggregates, right? So in other words, when you're talking about, they would say there's a selflessness of persons, but there has to be something that, it's not the person doesn't exist, right? People do exist. So what do you point to that illustrates the person? So most of these schools would say the 5 aggregates, right? That's what the Buddha taught, Then some of them, as he says here, the proponents from the Western region assert that the mental consciousness is the illustration, right? And that's because they're emphasizing mental consciousness as the most important of those, right? And they would also, the reason why they do that is they say, well, that's the one that goes from life to life. Those schools would say, if you say all the 5 aggregates, well, the body, the physical body, the form aggregate ceases at the time of death. It gets burned up, as Sujata gave the example of with her relative, right? So they would say, what is the illustration of the person must be that which goes from life to life, therefore it's the mental consciousness. And then, as he says here, the Kashmiri Vaibhashikas say it's the continuum of the 5 aggregates. So, and you see how what they're getting at is, in part, is how do you actually, and it's funny, what they're getting at, if you go to like enough Buddhist classes, which all of you here have done probably, eventually you'll hear somebody say, well, what goes, you'll hear somebody say this to a lama or something, where they'll say, well, if there's no self, what goes from life to life? What reincarnates? Somebody will ask that question, right? And we ask those questions, but people have been asking those questions ever since the Buddha. Does that make sense? Ever since the time of the Buddha, people have been saying, well, if there's no self, what reincarnates? Because the Buddha taught reincarnation, right? And so in part, when they're asking what is the illustration of the self, they're saying, what's the subject? Who's the perceiver, right? But they're also saying, and in what way does that perceiver exist and continue from life to life as the accumulator and experiencer of karma? Does that make sense? And so actually, do you see like why this idea of the continuum, for example, the continuum of the aggregates is an interesting, you can get a sense, I'm just pausing to say, if you think about it, right, why one school would say consciousness, many different Buddhist schools, the mental consciousness is the most common answer to that question, although it's not the only answer, right? Some of the higher schools, right? Because anyways, you can see why people would want to say mental consciousness, right? Because the body ends, but the mental consciousness, according to Buddhism, is beginningless and endless continuum, and it goes from life to life. But you can see how another school might want to say, well, wait a second, a person is not just their mental consciousness, right? They have a form. And form goes from life, so it's not, but you can't say this form is the person that goes from life to life. So they would say, well, it's the continuum of the 5 aggregates, right? Because whatever life you're in, if you're in hell, you have a body. If you're in human realm, you have a body. If you're an animal, you have a body. So it's the continuum of the aggregates. My point is, you can see how these different positions are just exploring this question of what goes from life to life and what is the nature of, even if the person is selfless, what's the nature of that person? They're exploring those questions. That's all. So that first section, there are various assertions. It's getting at that. How do these different schools of philosophy address that question? And then maybe we'll just cover one more part, I guess, and then we'll probably pause. So, for this class, but we'll cover one more part. So then we're covering, that of awareness. Now we're getting to awareness, to consciousness, right? And it's saying, how do you categorize? Earlier we categorized phenomena, right? Now we're categorizing consciousnesses or object possessors. And it says, if you want to categorize them in a very general way, there are valid cognizers and non-valid cognizers, right? And oops, I want to read something. Oops, I grabbed a book to share something with you, and Oh, it's here. So there's too many. Yeah, I don't want to go too far. I'm trying to decide how much to share with this, but basically, to put it simply, right, a valid cognizer cognizes things as they are, right? And one way that they sometimes get at that is it's they said one phrase they use, Jeffrey Hopkins' translation of it is an incontrovertible knower, right? And by the way, a valid cognition, right, is sometimes they call it, is sometimes translated different ways, but they're getting at pramana, right? So pramana means, that's is a valid, pramana is a valid cognition. And I shouldn't go too far, but anyway, so a valid cognizer is an incontrovertible knower, right? So it knows things as they are, and it will not be refuted, right? It's not going to be refuted, or it's not, won't be refuted. So then, and then there are non-valid cognizers. I should be able to share this for today, and then we'll go into it more next time. So one, Justin Choe Gyaltsen doesn't go into this much detail, but the commentaries do, so I'll mention it, is non-valid cognizers are obviously cognizers that are not valid, that are not correct. And one categorization lists four causes of error for non-valid cognizers, and that's worth thinking about. So I'll just go through those. We'll pause for questions. And so one cause of error for a this is it's worth thinking about. One cause of error for non-valid cognizers is sometimes the error comes from the side of the object. And they give the example there of if somebody were swinging, actually, if you've ever done it, like if you had they talk about a firebrand, but actually if you have a sparkler, or if you have an incense stick in the dark and you go like this, right, to your eye consciousness, a circle will appear, right? And there's no circle that exists, right? There's not a circular object there, right? There's not a round object there, right? So in that case, it's, and we know that, right? In other words, it's, we can know, like we play, in that sense, we're playing with it. We can play with it, right? You go, oh, wow, look, I'm seeing a circle, but I know there's no circle there. It's from the side. And I know it's not that my eye is faulty. It's that something's going on the side of the object that that's making it appear that way. But it's not a valid perception. The eye consciousness is not perceiving, is perceiving a circle, but the circle doesn't exist, and the fault of error is on the side of the object. A second one is a cause of error that is occurring from the side of the sense base. And there, the example that's often given, there are many examples, right? But if you look at the moon and your eye, you have something going on with your eyes where they're crossed, right? And you see two moons, or if you do it on purpose, right? If you look up at the moon and you cross your eyes on purpose, and you see two moons, your visual consciousness is perceiving two moons, but it's not it's not a valid cognition, right? There's only one moon around this planet, but you're seeing two, and the cause of error is from the side of the sense base. Then the third one is, the translator called it from the side of the abode. And that is a different one. That's the example they give there is, if you're on actually, I'll say it this way: like if you fell asleep on a raft or a boat or something, and then you woke up and you looked up and you saw trees moving, right? And your eye consciousness saw the trees moving. You thought, wow, why are those trees moving, right? And the fault of error in that case is not the trees, and it's not your eye consciousness. It's the abode you're on in that sense, right? It's that you're on a boat. And therefore, your eye consciousness is perceiving trees as moving, but it's actually you moving, and the trees aren't moving from their own side. So you would say that's an example of a cause of error from the side of the abode. And the next one in this categorization of 4 causes of non-valid cognizers is where the cause of error is from the immediately preceding condition. And that's where it's not the abode, it's not the object, and it's not the sense base, it's something else. And the example they usually give there is if a person is completely enraged and then they look around and they see things as red. You've talked to people, so I've talked to people like that, right? They were so enraged that everything looked red to them. And there, the cause of error is their own rage. It's not the sense, it's not the abode they're sitting in, it's not the object, and it's not their eye consciousness. It's there's something faulty in there in the immediately preceding condition that led to that. Experience. But so then I'll just step back for a moment before I stop and say, so this idea of valid cognizers and non-valid cognizers, and then we're going to get into types of valid cognition and direct valid cognizers and so on. I just want to say some general comments, which are, one is, this is a humongous area of study in Buddhism, right? I mean, pramana, so there's like Dharmakirti wrote a pramana text, and then Dignaga wrote important pramana text, and then Dharmakirti wrote commentaries to that. It's a huge area of study. We're not studying pramana here, but in detail. But what we're going to start to get at just a little bit from this school's perspective, and then some of the other schools' perspectives, is actually, and what this is, I often think about it, like in English, we often talk about epistemology. The question is, how do you know what you know, right? And so at least that has been studied, some. But these are like sort of Buddhist explanations of, and part of what I want to just raise as a question just to think about before we stop is like, one is like, I just think this is funny, like, just pausing and think about it, like, actually, it's weird, isn't it? Like one I'm just pausing, it's complicated, because one is, in Buddhism, it's a humongous important question, right? Actually, and I'm sort of pausing because I'm thinking, like, in our society now, actually, sorry, pausing, I'm sometimes guilty of it, right? It's really easy to, like, we so focus on what other people are grasping at that's inaccurate, right? Like, I mean, sometimes lately I find like with some of the conspiracy theory things that are that you read about, right? Like, I can get very sad, really, like to think of, like, when, if you hear of somebody believing something that's totally, sometimes sad, sometimes scared, sometimes very deeply disturbed, like, if you read that somebody's, or hear where somebody's believing in something that's really, well, that's hateful and dangerous, of course, right? Then we go, oh wow, like, that would be a non-valid cognition, right? by definition. So these points are, so one point I'm getting at is these points about what's valid cognition and what's not valid cognition are really important. Does that make sense? Like, it could seem like we're being philosophical, which we are, in a way, but it's not hard right now, right? Like, in other words, if somebody has a non-valid cognition, actually right now, because of various circumstances, right? Like, it can often, I mean, you can see, right, actually the world is teaching us right now in a way about how if we can't differentiate between valid cognition and non-valid cognition, it's a matter of life and death, right? Like, the virus gets transmitted more because people don't know how to differentiate valid and non-valid cognition. Or people storm the Capitol because they don't know how to differentiate between valid and non-valid cognition. Or people kill each other because they can't differentiate between valid and non-valid cognition. So this question, I mean, you could say, oh, well, we're studying some philosophical thing, but I just want to point out, literally, I mean, it's always, it's always a matter of life and death, but right now it's obvious that it's a matter of life and death. So the world is sort of giving us a teaching in that sense about the importance of this topic. And then what Buddhism is raising for us, again, what I was starting to say a few minutes ago, is it's really easy to look at how other people are having non-valid cognitions. What's hard, of course, is to ask, how am I having non-valid cognitions? And are my cognitions valid? And too often we don't question that, do we? Like it's, you know, it's like much easier to question somebody else's, the validity of somebody else's cognitions than to question the validity of one's own. And what Buddhism is saying is your main job, my main job, is to explore the validity of my own cognitions. Does that make sense? And to ask that question. And I'll just say that, like, often, like, just the other, what was it? One day I was talking, just recently I was talking to Shayla about something, and like we were talking about something related to this, and I just very quickly I was like, wow, what if I'm wrong? Like, what if I'm misperceiving this? And then I just stopped, and I was like, oh, I'm just so glad I asked that question. Like, I don't know if I was not sure if I was wrong or right yet, but I was just so happy I even asked the question. I was like, oh wow, I just asked, am I wrong? That's great. Like, you know, people need to do that. We all need to do that. Like, in other words, you know, and I didn't say, are you wrong? Or is whoever it was wrong? I said, you know, I paused just to go, am I wrong? And I was like, oh, what a relief. I asked that question. I must be doing something, you know, like all this Buddhist stuff must be helping a little. I asked the right question. And we all should ask that question. And that's, so I'm just getting at this question of valid cognition is hugely important. You know, and again, I know, like, if we start, we're going to get into next time, direct valid cognition, inferential cognition, and so on. And you could ask, why am I studying that? Why does that matter? But why it matters is, like, you know, first of all, it's a conceptual framework to understand it. But then the idea is you have to have a framework to then say, well, how do I know what I know? How do I know if what I, you know, and that was it. I was thinking of, like, I was like, well, people, like, I was like, you know, whatever it was, like, you know, people believe, you know, I guess I don't want to repeat them, but, like, you know, people believe things that sometimes I read it and I'm just like, or I hear it and I'm just like, I want to cry or something. That somebody in power is asserting something that's so hateful and ridiculous, you know. But the point is, like, wow, how am I doing that also? In what ways am I misperceiving? And if I say I know something, how do I know it? You know, what's scary is, right, people are so, what's the word? Like, you know, I said earlier, valid cognition is incontrovertible, right? And isn't it scary that, like, people who believe things that are wrong, if you look at somebody else, first of all, and you see, like, there are many examples, right, where somebody believes something that is obviously ludicrous, right? But they believe it, like, so strongly that they would kill you if they could, over your disagreeing with them about it. And then to ask yourself, how am I like that? Where are the areas where I believe something so viscerally, but I might be wrong? And what I want to assert is, we're all like that, according to Buddhism, unless you're an Arya, right? As I said earlier, unless you're a noble being who's seen reality directly, at least you're grasping at yourself as an example of that, right? And as long as you grasp at yourself that way, then you, according to Buddhism, you'll grasp at other things that way, right? And then you'll believe things that are ridiculous because of ignorance, right? And part of it, so this question of valid cognition and non-valid cognition, I just want to emphasize, again, it's like, it seems like, oh, it's just words, but this is important stuff, actually, you know. And if we can get good at, you know, so we're going to study a little bit next time, but if we can get a little bit of useful skills from this school at just how to ask those questions, then we can start going, like, wow, how am I wrong? How am I misperceiving? You know, and I think what we'll, you know, hopefully what we find is, like, there are lots of ways that we misperceive, right? And if we get closer, each time we catch a misperception, that's a gift, right? Because we're getting closer to reality. That's the idea here of valid cognition and non-valid cognition, is that we want to study this to realize, you know, when I see something as deeply desirable, am I having a valid cognition or a non-valid cognition? You know, when you know, there are all kinds of things like that, right? When I'm upset with somebody, am I having a valid cognition or a non-valid cognition? You know, and these apply not just to things, you know, out there somewhere far away, right? When you perceive your family members, do you perceive them with valid cognition in moments, right? In any given moment, with a valid cognition or a non-valid cognition? And how does that affect you? So anyway, it's a huge subject, and we're not going to study that much of it because it's just tenets part of it, but But you know, there's a nice section here on that about different ways of doing that. So we'll cover them and just talk a little bit about it next time. But it's 12:30, so we should stop. So let's do our dedication. The supreme jewel Bodhichitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In this snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. Thank y'all. Good to see
Hey,
everybody.
Lauren, can I stay on for 1 second and do a screen share so you